All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to have you join our webinar. We cannot see our slides just yet, but it's going to happen. This is a great allegory of what happens sometimes when we work on curriculum, pedagogy, and instruction in dual language settings. Sometimes we don't have our materials, but today we have an amazing panel that is going to talk to us through the process of what we do to make sure that we have what we need for emergent bilinguals. So we want to thank so much our funders, the Kellogg Foundation and the Heisen Simmons Foundation for making this work possible. We really couldn't do it without them. With that, we'll go to our next slide, please. So if you're familiar with our webinar series, we have been doing a series of presentations to highlight various dimensions of quality in dual language settings. And this comes from one of our reports called Operationalizing High Quality Dual Language Immersion Programming. We'll put the link to that report shortly, but we also have written a series of other reports on access to these programs. With that, we'll go to our next slide, please. Without further ado, I'm really excited and honored to have our panelists introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, one by one coming off mute and just telling us your name and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Giovanni Santiago. I'm from Puerto Rico and kindergarten teacher in BPA. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi there, my name is Ali Hoish, and I am Senora Santiago's partner, and I am also a dual language instructor in Arizona.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gladys Aponte. I am a postdoctoral research scholar with the Children's Equity Project and a former dual language bilingual teacher myself. Good to be here.
Gracias.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to participate. My name is Heather Skibbins. I'm an associate director at SEAL, the Sobrato Early Academic Language. I'm also first and foremost a bilingual teacher, taught for 15 years as a dual language teacher here in California. And then about 10 years ago, met Dr. Lori Olson and joined the SEAL team. And since then, have spent the last 10 years really working with teachers and sites to create systems change at all levels to centralize our multilingual learners in our classrooms and our schools. So thanks for inviting me to participate.
Welcome, and we're so excited to have everyone. I think everybody introduced themselves. Are we missing Dr. Espinosa?
All right. Okay. Well, good afternoon. I'm Linda Espinosa, and I'm currently professor emeritus from the University of Missouri-Columbia. But I spent 17 years as a program director and administrator in the state of California. Worked closely with the California State Department of Ed on the Early Learning Foundations, the Desired Results Developmental Profile, or the assessment system, and the revised and updated guidelines for supporting all children's languages in the curriculum guidelines. So anyway, it's exciting to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to what everyone has to say.
Thank you, everyone. We are so excited to hear from each of you and just honored to have a mix of researchers, current and former teachers, who better, right, to provide information about pedagogy, curriculum, and instruction in dual language settings. And with that, we'll kind of start going deeper into today's topic. We'll go to the next slide, please. So like as I was saying before, our conversation today is part of a larger conversation derived from our framework of high quality dual language immersion that has 7 components, starting from programmatic structures, language allocation, and today we're going to focus on the domain of curriculum, instruction, and pedagogy. Go to our next slide, please. Some examples of high quality indicators in dual language settings related to curricula, instruction, and pedagogy is making sure that the curricula is research supported. When possible, this would be curricula that would be developed specific for emergent bilinguals, but as Dr. Espinosa will share in a little bit, this is difficult and not quite available. So we do our best. And so what we can do is we can adapt curricula to make sure that it fits within dual language programming. We want to make sure that pedagogy is aligned with ideal learning principles that we know work for all children. So things like play-based learning, following children's lead, using the environment as a third teacher. We know these are all wonderful practices for all children, including children that are bilingual in dual language settings. One thing to note that's very important for this population, though, is making sure that each aspect of the pedagogy curriculum instruction has oral language development as a core ingredient to help children not only acquire English, but really to become bilingual. And in terms of that, we want to make sure that there's really explicit opportunities for children to develop cross-linguistic connections. And last but certainly not least, it's really important that all materials and lessons sustain or embed children's cultural, linguistic, and other forms of identities. We're going to get into this in a little second, but these are some of the things that we found in our research and are highlighted in our report. We'll go to the next slide, please. And now we're going to, today we're going to do a little dance between no slides and slides. So for this first dance, no slides, we're just going to start talking to two of our teachers. Thank you. We're going to start with Miss Santiago, La Señora Santiago, and Miss Hoyt. You're both co-teachers at a dual language program in Arizona. One of our CEO's our kindergarten teacher's daughter, right? So we're so excited to have you, and it's such an honor. We know that in many dual language programs, the co-teaching model is a common approach to provide instruction in each language. Can you please start by telling us what is the co-teaching model exactly?
Yeah, Senora Santiago, do you want to do, or you want me to do it? Sorry, we're usually together, but Senora Santiago just had surgery. So we're in separate places right now, so we're out of sorts.
No worries.
Santiago, do you want me to begin? Well,
You can start.
okay, I'll go ahead and
then
okay.
you can start and then
So basically what a co-teaching model is that we have two groups of students and we share those students, right? So we are a 50-50 model. So that means 50% of the time the kids are with Senora Santiago and they learn the subjects of math, math, science, and Spanish. And then with me, they learn the ELA subjects. So that would be like reading foundations, ELA, and social studies. And how it works with us is, like I said, it's that 50-50 model. And so we have about 45 students all together. But when one has, so we will switch classes. So when I have one class, Senora Santiago will have another class, and then we will flip-flop. And so it works different in different schools. Like even in Phoenix, there are different schools that follow different models, but that is the model that we use, is 50-50.
Thank you. Ms. Santiago, do you want to add more to that explanation?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. So it's very important to explain that I doing math, but she never doing math. Okay, so the parents sometimes they confuse those concepts, but they thought that they can translate the math with her, and it's not correctly. We cannot doing like a translation. If we're doing that thing, the student cannot learn another language. So they take everything for me for math, science, and Spanish. In Spanish, we have only, for example, things that is similar, like we doing Haggerty together. She's doing in English and I doing in Spanish. We using the same hands to doing together or rhymes, but the language is different. So it's nice for the kids because they know already about the TPR, about the hands and everything, but they know different. It's the language. They know what is rhyme, what is rima. When it's rima is rhyme, they understand. We use a lot of cognatos, ¿cómo se dice? And
Cognates.
yeah, and this is amazing that they focus in everything. Yeah.
That's
This
So
great.
is-
even though our subjects are different, we try to um mirror each other as far as like routines and procedures go. Senora Santiago was talking about Hegarty. Hegarty is an early phonemic awareness curriculum. So she has a Spanish edition, I have an English edition. And for example, our hand gestures are the same, right? So they're working on the same skill, just in different languages. And as you know, well, I don't know if everybody knows this, but Spanish is a lot easier to pick up on those skills, right? And English is a little bit harder, and then sometimes it's vice versa. So that is the one thing where we are together on. But other than that, our subjects are different, right? Because Senora Santiago is doing math and science, and I'm doing ELA and social studies. And so, kind of what she was trying to touch on is that uh, that area where the kids are not getting a direct translation, that is where the learning happens.
Mhm.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit more about how you actually plan together to have those connections? Like I'm hearing you say that there are things that are general across the two languages and things that are different. So talk us a little bit more of what your planning looks like for a co-teaching model.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, oh, you can go ahead, Sonia Santiago. Go ahead.
No. Do it and I jump.
Okay. Okay, she'll jump in with me. So, basically how it works is that we've been working, this is our third year together. So, we have now kind of been, we're really on the same page, right? Because we've been working together for more than a couple years. But how it works is that we start by, of course, looking at the standards, right? Our district has standards that they want us to tackle every quarter. So we start with the standards, and then we'll talk about what we are going to cover that week specifically. So, for example, we have done like fairy tales and fables. That's what we have coming up. That's an ELA standard, but how Senora Santiago can cover that as well, and her and I will talk about this, is we can do the same stories in English as we do in Spanish, right?
Mhm.
And so we go ahead and we try and do that. We also will talk about if we are implementing a new routine or procedure, whether that's how do you line up or how do I get materials. We will talk about how we do that, and then we will implement that together. So whether it's that we use like an acronym. So for example, the kids in our school, they use something called pause. So pause, so they'll show us their hands. A, attention. W, walk. And then S would be sit and start. Senora Santiago has that same routine, but in Spanish. And so when we have those kind of routines in place the same, that helps our planning for instruction go a little bit easier, right? And so just kind of what I covered before, we do stories the same. Sometimes we will do other projects that are similar. Senora Santiago, I'll go ahead and I'll let you jump in here.
For example, we do similar. We use sentence frames. Okay, so we always start in blue the nouns, el nombre. Okay, the verb in another color. You know, similar color that they understand that color is a verb. It's el verbo. When I write. Okay, so we're doing a similar, but it's at different colors, but they understand that is the nouns or verbs, and it's easy for them when we write the sentence frame. I use two different Hergery, estrellitas, and listos that is for Spanish, and the 90% of my students understand Spanish like this because it's very faster. She's jealous about me about the Spanish because the kids know very, more faster the part of Spanish that they take, and we use the same rhythm. Even when we make the line, the fila, We use it pam para pam 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 pam. We use the same sounds, the same rhythm, and they understand. And that's the mirror that she said about that.
Yes. So by having the same routines and procedures, even though we teach slightly different subjects, it's able to help the kids transition and to help us transition, right? Because we're dealing with a large number of kids, and also we're dealing with 2 different languages, right? So we all have to be on the same page. We're also meeting like every day, all the time. Every day, at least twice a day, we'll come in and we'll say, oh, how's this student doing? How's that student doing? Oh, they had a hard time with this. Like, what do you do? So just that natural collaboration, it is just a little bit closer since we share students.
That's excellent. I like the intentionality of finding that convergence between the languages, that metalinguistic awareness that's built by using colors and thinking about sentence structures. I know we're gonna talk about that too from other people, but it's great to hear that the things that you're all doing in the classroom are so well aligned with research and also some of the frameworks that we're gonna lift up today. Now, before we let you go, wanted to ask one more question. We know that you're kindergarten teachers, and kindergarten teachers are superheroes for many reasons, including the fact that you are also pivotal in setting the foundation for biliteracy development. So I wanted to talk about that for a minute. Can you talk us a little bit more about how to build early literacy bilingualism in a dual language setting, and what approaches do you use? Can you tell us more about how you build these connections across the languages, please?
Yeah, so that's actually one of our initiatives at the school that we're at, Biltmore Prep, is that we want biliteracy by 8th grade, which is the last year, right? But how we build that in the beginning is how we're going to get that future biliteracy for those 8th graders. So Senora Santiago and I, we both use explicit instruction. And so what that would entail is that is, again, just kind of what we talked about earlier, those routines and procedures embedded in the curriculum. So I know Senora Santiago, she uses a curriculum called Estrellita, and it's an explicit phonics curriculum for Spanish. I use something called 95%. So that's an explicit English curriculum for teaching reading, right? And so those programs are very similar to each other, and they are helping to build the biliteracy. Now, how are they helping? They're using the same skills. So they start in both Estrellita and 95%. They will start with just, of course, the letter sounds, right? But before that, we do a great deal of work on, like what Senora Santiago was saying with Hegarty. Early literacy starts, no matter what language, with those phonemic awareness skills, right? So that's like rhyme, just like Senora Santiago was saying, that's rima. So we're working on that same skill. Also onset rhyme, blending and segmenting words and syllables. We are doing the same thing, but in different languages. And that, to me, is the foundation that we're building, right? Because if they are not hearing, if they cannot hear these sounds or hear the differences, it's going to be hard when we start to do actual letters, right? And we attach a grapheme to a sound. So we are really intentional about taking that time and using that. And building their phonemic awareness across both languages before we start, I guess, diving into, say, reading sight words or anything else like that. The first things first, they have to have that phonemic awareness down.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's helpful. And we know that explicit instruction in phonics that takes into consideration both languages is key, while also making sure that children are immersed in a rich language interaction. So we're not just focusing on phonics, although that's super important, but making sure that we have that other piece of the structure balance approach. Thank you so much to both of you. It's like I could hear you talking all day. It's so helpful to hear what this looks like in practice. So thank you. Thank you. So much helpful information. And I just want to thank you for all the amazing work that you do. Such an honor. We're going to transition now. We've talked about co-teaching models from underground teachers doing all the work. And now we're going to take a step back and talk briefly about pedagogy. And one of the big things that has been coming up in the field is this idea of a translanguaging pedagogy. So with that, we're going to pass it over to Gladys, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about, first of all, what is a translanguaging pedagogy? I think many people have made very different definitions of what that is, and confusion, and even some feelings about it. So can you help us feel better about translanguaging pedagogy? What in the world is that? Let's start with that, and then we'll ask for some examples.
Sure, I'll try. So translanguaging pedagogy refers to the teaching practices that explicitly and intentionally recognize and validate and build on the language practices that children are bringing into the classroom. It builds on their language repertoire. So by that, I mean all the languages that children know and their nonverbal communication practices like signs and movement, drawings, expressions. So dual language teachers that teach in either of the languages allocated time and space can and should implement translanguaging spaces in their classrooms. And as we pointed out in the previous conversation of this webinar series, those translanguaging spaces can be as long as a whole 45-minute lesson, or it can be as simple as a purposeful planning to take 30 seconds during a read aloud in English, for example, to remind children that they can use their Spanish to help them decipher the meaning of an unknown word. So like if they don't know the word culpable in the book, then they can think, what word does it sound like? Culpable, which they may know, right? So that's one example that shows how supporting children in using their full language repertoires can help them develop their bilingualism and biliteracy. Some other examples are seen here on the screen. So the first example of the flower diagram on the left demonstrates how a kindergarten teacher helps children make connections across their languages to help them better understand the concepts that are being taught in that unit, for example. It also can be used to teach cognates, pétalo, petal, right? In the middle, we see another example of translanguaging pedagogy. And here, a group of 3-year-olds are putting on a puppet show to recreate the Three Little Pigs. And we know that it's important to read books that are culturally relevant to children, but we can also support emergent literacy skills by helping children bring their bilingual experiences and their bilingual imaginations into the interpretation and recreation and retelling of more mainstream books like this one. So here, the children, the 3-year-olds, decided to add bilingual family dynamics to their interpretation of the three little Goldilocks and the three bears. Sorry, not the Three Little Pigs. Goldilocks and the three bears. And they decided that the baby bear spoke Spanish, for example, and the parent bears spoke mostly English. And instead of porridge, Goldilocks had eaten their avena, or their oatmeal, which related more to their own experiences, right? So the final example I'll share that's on the left side of this, on the right side of the screen, is this translanguaging lesson in which children are analyzing authors' craft, and they're writing down the different reasons that authors may choose to use their entire linguistic repertoire in their text. So as bilingual writers, right, we don't have to solely write in English and solely in Spanish, right? So students noticed this, and as they went through books in their classroom library, and even through their own narratives that they were drafting, and they compiled this list, as you see this child adding to it, of the many reasons that authors choose to incorporate translanguaging in their texts. So you can see that translanguaging pedagogy is important also because it fosters metalinguistic awareness, or their understanding of how their languages work, which we'll talk about a bit later, but also helps develop their bilingual pride and gives them a better understanding of who they are as bilingual people, right? A better understanding of their identities as bilingual speakers, which is something that's often disregarded and overlooked in dual language bilingual settings that do not embrace the translanguaging stance, right? It's important to stop and think about our bilingualism and look at both of our languages side by side.
That's so excellent. Thank you. I've been into programs where I've heard teachers say, you can't answer that in this language. And it just misses the opportunity to help children, first of all, build that the ability to take risks, which is huge for language learning, but also that the use of a whole linguistic repertoire that we know is an asset. And so I just really appreciate these concrete examples and a reminder that it doesn't have to be anything long, and it doesn't mean we're throwing away the separation of the languages for instruction, but just creating these opportunities. And it sounds like for educators, we need the mindset that really acknowledges that it's okay and it's normal for bilingual children to engage with language in different ways, including the use of 2 or more languages or modalities at the same time. So thank you so much for that. This is super helpful. We've talked about pedagogy. This is a fast track. Now we're going to talk about curriculum. We don't, if you don't mind, Melissa, let's go to our next slide. We're going to transition now to talk about general guidelines for selecting curricula for dual language immersion programs. And Linda, you are one of the leaders in the field. And as we talk about Latinx Heritage Month, I want to honor you for all your amazing work that has allowed younger generations to do this work. So shout out to all your awesome work. I've known your name for a very long time, and I thank you. And because of that, you've been critical in leading our field to understanding what does high quality preschool curricula look like. And you are part of an amazing effort to synthesize all the research on this topic through the NASEM report on high quality preschool curricula. Can you talk a little bit more about what this report is about and what were the major findings?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And sometimes it is a little overwhelming to look at how long you have been doing this work. But anyway, regardless, I did co-chair the NASEM study on a new vision for high quality preschool curriculum. And in that study, which we just published the spring of 2024, it was a product of 2 years of work to look at what does high quality preschool curriculum look like through the lens of equity and through the lens of diversity. And so one of the needs for this particular report on updating the view of from the field about what constitutes high quality, I thought an important emphasis for our discussion today was there is a clear need for equitable access for all children to preschool experiences that foster holistic and healthy development regardless of place or socioeconomic status, affirm children's full identities, including race, culture, home, language, gender, and ability, and recognize and build on their strengths while providing the supports they need to reach their full potential. And I would say that's one of the themes woven throughout the whole report is that many children, because of race or language or even where they live or their socioeconomic status, have been denied either access or appropriate educational support because the strengths and assets that they bring into the preschool program are never recognized and even sometimes viewed as deficits. So shifting from this deficit view of children who don't speak English, what don't they know in English, which, I mean, and I've been in the field so long. I mean, that was California's been through the language wars for 30 years now. So until I would say the last 10 years or so, the general view is if they don't know it in English, they don't know it, and that's simply not true. So we provide a lot of the scientific evidence for what does development look like that has gone unrecognized for certain populations of children with disabilities, children who are Black or African American, Indigenous children, Latinx children who speak Spanish in the home, and children of other home language backgrounds. So we feel these children have not been adequately recognized for their capabilities and for their potential in preschool settings to date through the curriculum, through our evaluation methods. I mean, it just runs through everything that we've done for decades, has essentially, I mean, and I say this knowing that in full well we are making a turn. We are shifting our view of children in general, and we have the science to do it. But I think in many ways, our approaches have, in fact, denied them access to all of their cognitive potential and further marginalized, their ability to be successful in the dominant society. And this report is really an attempt to change that with science, because I don't know about you, but when I was running programs and talking with school boards and administrators and whatnot, they want to know the data. They want to know, can you tell me that this is going to lead to higher achievement scores in the long run? Will these kids now graduate from high school? So we reviewed all of the available quantitative research, qualitative research, case studies, ethnographics. We reviewed everything, and each of the chapter focuses on one aspect of that. So, from what we've been talking about, though, when we talk about developmentally appropriate curriculum, so what we did was try to put bones on that, or put meat on the bones, so that when we say that, what do we mean for children who don't speak English, who maybe have a disability, who are in our preschool classrooms? How do we arrange classrooms and instruction and pedagogy so that those children will also have equal opportunities? So we really wanted to address issues like, what is developmentally appropriate for all groups of children? What are the outcomes that we look at when we consider a program successful or a child successful? Do we have the right outcomes for children from different cultural backgrounds? And obviously, as you know, we haven't for a long time. It's been an English-only society, and if you do assess in languages other than English, you're the exception, not the rule. So anyway, that was sort of the context, the frame within which we worked over 2 years. Oh, next slide. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. Mike, it's probably a question everybody else is wondering about. So having said that, like, we know that this is really important and it's something the field is shifting towards, but we're not quite ready yet. So I guess the $1 million question is, like, is there a best curricula for early childhood emergent bilinguals in dual language settings? And if not, what are some of the ingredients that we should be thinking about for this population?
Well, that's an excellent question, because it's a complicated question. Let me put it that way. So much of what we know from the existing research is from studies that have really looked at English progress in English acquisition, English language arts, etc. The few studies that have looked at a bilingual approach have generally concluded, and actually, if we go to the next slide, I can support this, but have generally concluded that young children, number one, have the capacity to learn multiple languages and benefit from learning more than one language. All children learn that. What we don't have right now are sufficient evidence-based curricula, comprehensive curricula, that addresses language needs, multiple language needs, in an equitable way. So we have some, like Estrellita, that are in Spanish only. We have some curricula that have been translated into Spanish. They were developed in English, and the developers were English speakers, but then they've been translated, and that carries with it risks because of the issues around language equivalencies and whatnot. And then we have some curricula that have developed supplementary materials that help teachers adapt their existing curriculum for children from different languages and cultures. And there is current work, and it's just wonderful, great work. And I have to say, Sigrid and Chantel and everybody at the Children's Equity Project, you are pushing this issue forward, because what everybody knows is teachers need explicit guidance, and they need materials to support that guidance. So there has to be a common understanding of what our goals are for children, what progress looks like, and then the materials to support that inclusive instruction that rests on certain principles. But can I go to the next slide? So to answer your question quickly, we don't have a specific curriculum. And because we need, and almost all state standards require, comprehensive curricula that address all domains of development, what we have are some adaptations within those, and sometimes translations within those, to meet the needs of children from diverse backgrounds, but they're not fully developed. As you know, there's still a lot of work to do, and we need the right people developing that type of curriculum. When I say right people, I mean people that represent the cultures and language and backgrounds of the children. and not simply direct translation.
That's
Okay?
It reminds me that, we're talking about pedagogy and instruction today, but it's part of a system. And so we need to be able to fund the kind of research developed by community insiders that are experts on these topics to start creating the sort of things that are actually authentic and evidence-based, right? Because I think we use terms like culturally responsive or sustaining, but we're not so sure what that actually means. So my dream world is one in which all these systems will align to make sure that we can support administrators and teachers in dual language settings. And with that, we're going to transition. We are grateful that our people, oops, sorry, go ahead. So we'll go to our next slide.
We skipped a slide, but
Yeah.
went back.
Back to the previous slide, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So I picked out the two main conclusions that relate to dual language learners, and these are reinforcing what you've been talking about today, the importance of these conclusions. Out of 18 conclusions and 18 recommendations that we had and 3 research agenda items and whatnot, we are explicitly saying in a report from NASEM, which again, many people need this to persuade their existing administrator, school structure, whatever, but this is the way to go. So we need provides guidance for content-specific teaching, and that means you have to address math and science and social studies. You have to have content that you use these multiple languages in for, and supports whole child development, including cultural and linguistic adaptation. So we are saying very explicitly, and we expand on that in chapter 7, what that means. So how do you do that when you're a monolingual English-speaking teacher and you have a curriculum that was primarily written in English? So how do you make these adaptations? And then the most effective language model. And this is based on science. This is not a bilingual advocacy position. This is based upon a huge, diverse committee that reviewed all the research on it. That multilingual learners systematically teaches them English while actively supporting their home language development. So everybody needs to be in on the same page on what our goals are for children. And that implies a lot of other structural elements, including assessment and parent involvement and whatnot. So, and then the next slide is just how you can access the report. And we go to that. And if you don't want to read the whole report, and I would be shocked if you did read the whole report, chapter 7 is this chapter that focuses on multilingual early childhood.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful. We've also placed a link to this report in our chat, so feel free to access that as well. If we don't mind going to the next slide, one more slide, and 2 more slides. Let's go to 2 slides forward. And now we're going to pass it over to Heather, who's going to introduce the SEALS P3 framework. She'll tell us a lot more about what it is. And so let's just we're going to highlight this instructional framework first, and then we're going to transition to another framework. But Heather, could you tell us a little bit more about the purpose of this framework?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to share SEALS P3 framework with everybody today. It was written by Dr. Lori Olson, and we're actually just celebrating the 1-year anniversary of its release, which is really wonderful. This framework was built upon SEAL's work in schools over the last 15 years, and it really aims to help move the field to more fully center our multilingual learners, especially in these early years of schooling. At SEAL, our mission is to provide asset-based, engaging, joyful, rich learning experiences for children and their families, and to move English learners from the margins to the core of our approaches and our policies and our practices. And this P3 framework really envisions a cohesive system where the expertise is integrated, the commitment is shared, and there's alignment between all of these practices. We know that in the past, we've really siloed early education systems from the K-12 system. And so this is really our effort to knit that together with an integrated approach that really centers on English learners. Some of the components in the P3 framework, if you want to go to the next slide, there are 8 key understandings that ground this framework, and then these 11 design principles. These are all aimed at dismantling and redesigning educational practices to better meet children's needs. And to provide them what everyone has shared so far today, what we know they deserve. So these principles emphasize things like family partnership, teacher agency, as well as classrooms that are assets-oriented, needs-responsive, student-centered, joyful, one of our favorite words in SEAL, and really engaged learning environments. It also outlines how important it is to have instruction that, just like Linda was saying, that provides meaningful access to the full curriculum, and that includes our science, our social studies, our art standards, that all of that is integrated and really language rich. You want to go to the next slide? At SEAL, we're really purposeful with this idea of integrating language, literacy, and content through thematic instruction. So we're combining that biliteracy development with the science standards, with the social studies standards. This approach really incorporates those oral language skills, those biliteracy skills in with the content standards. We know that when kids are excited about what they're learning, there's a purpose for the reading, for the writing, for the foundational skills work. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a little glimpse of what that looks like in the classroom. Here are some photos just that illustrate what that integration of complex academic language and literacy development look like within a thematic unit. Here are some kindergartners. They're in the midst of a thematic unit on community workers, and they're having some hands-on opportunities to try on the jobs of people in the community. These two veterinarians were having a really thoughtful discussion about the illness and the treatment needed for their dog, and they were writing out prescriptions, again, just using those sounds that they knew at that point. The other child, dressed as a bombero or firefighter, is actually being the teacher while she uses this graphic organizer to teach some of her fellow students about different aspects of how firefighters impact our community. So this is what that integration of language, literacy, and content looks like. And it really requires us to have an instructional vision that isn't siloed, where a literacy block is not happening in total isolation from content. In this classroom, kiddos are able to apply those foundational literacy skills they're learning directly into these meaningful knowledge-based learning activities. This integration is joyful and that kind of effective instruction that we aim to provide in all of our classrooms.
Thank you so much. I love, they say pictures can communicate 1,000 words, and these pictures are so helpful to see what we're talking about. We want children not to just be in these isolated contexts where they're learning words through just vocabulary drills, as is done many times with emergent bilinguals. Just looking at these pictures, I can tell it's like a high quality language and learning environment where children are having fun. Like, I want to be there. There's the use of visuals, which is another evidence-based strategy for children that are learning more languages. And I'm seeing different connections. So I think this is a wonderful framework. We do highlight that framework. Cannot believe it was a year ago already that we started talking about the framework, but we have it in our report. And of course, we have the SEAL website in our chat for you to learn more. So thank you. This is great. Now we're going to pass it over to our next slide so we can talk about another framework. Linda, you were a major part of developing, we'll go to one more slide. You were one of the major people who developed the framework called Personalized Oral Language Learning, or POL framework. Can you please describe what is the purpose of POL and what are the key strategies that you're addressing with the framework?
Sure, thank you. Well, POL, we originally designed it when Ramon Cortinas was superintendent in Los Angeles Unified School District. And he decided in 2010 that the state needed a transitional kindergarten program. So he hired me and some colleagues to design a new program for transitional kindergarten. And during our first inaugural year, we had about 36 classrooms, and we were just coming out of an English-only phase in the state of California. And in our inaugural classrooms where we field tested this approach, about 85% of the children were not native English speakers. Some of the teachers spoke Spanish and English and some did not. But our charge was really to design a curriculum or an approach to curriculum that would meet the needs of very diverse children. And luckily we had a very supportive superintendent. it has since, so we designed some specific strategies intentionally for guidance for monolingual English-speaking teachers who need to feel that they are capable of addressing the learning needs of children with whom they may not share a language and may not really have a similar understanding of their cultural background. One of the things that I've found, like for 30 years, is oftentimes when teachers are newly enrolling children who are not native English speakers, they become overwhelmed and feel I can't learn that language. I don't know that they have to speak English or whatever. I mean, I've seen that in programs that I've directed, that it seems a little overwhelming. It seems impossible because we can't learn 10 languages, automatically. That's a challenging task for an adult. So, so we designed these strategies so teachers wouldn't feel overwhelmed, and there are specific, explicit strategies that every single teacher can do, and a sort of that you don't have to do everything at once, but we can gently enter into this field, and you can meet the needs of children from different languages, even though you don't speak their language. So that was the origin of it. It was picked up by Fresno Unified School District as part of their language learning project. And we refined and expanded and evaluated it. And then the California Department of Ed funded expansion efforts. So it's now in dozens of school districts in California, and districts across the nation as well have received training in this particular approach. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what we did as a team originally, as curriculum developers, was to sit down and develop a common view of what are the evidence-based principles for meeting the needs of dual language learners. In California, we've since shifted that language to multilingual learners. And so these are the basis of POLE. Learning 2 or more languages during the early childhood years is a strength, not a weakness. So remember, we developed this in 2010, 2013. That was not necessarily the general understanding of children who are not native English speakers. And strong home language skills. And that has to be a huge emphasis because people don't intuitively understand that. Combined with English appears to be the best preparation for school success. In other words, emergent bilingualism. And for our training cohorts, one of the things that I used to say, what we need to tattoo on our forehead is 2 is better than 1, across the board, no doubt, science is there, and earlier is better than later. And again, no doubt, science definitively supports both those positions. We can just drill those into our hearts and minds. I think we can be more responsive to the languages and cultures. And our educators need to continuously build their knowledge and skills because the science keeps advancing, and what we know is best in the long term. So I'll just read this quickly. Children given the opportunity to develop competence in 2 or more languages early in life benefit from their capacity to communicate in more than 1 language and may show enhancement. And since this study, 2017, I would change that, will show enhancement in certain cognitive skills as well as improved academic outcomes in school. So we now really do have the data that this is scientifically, universally appropriate. So, it is concluded by scientists doing research in this area. So let's go to the next slide. So this was one approach, POLE, within this language learning project. It's not the only approach that was developed and refined to reflect the research. And again, we've talked about all of this, building on child and family strengths. Earlier is better. And again, this is something that, when I first started out in this, people used to say, and it was the policy in the state of California not to introduce a second language till kindergarten, and then only 10%. And then gradually increase the amount of English. And unsurprisingly, the majority of children never actually became fluent in English and mostly lost their home language. But anyway, this idea of starting early because children have this, I call it the bilingual brilliance, but children are brilliant at learning multiple languages. And once we understand that, we'll be less afraid to expose them to both English and the home language. The strong family partnerships is really the foundation for so much of what we do in terms of equity, in terms of cultural responsiveness, et cetera. Strengthen language interactions, and our program has very specific strategies about that, and an emphasis on oral language. And I would just say one thing. For children who are learning a second language, and most of this is done with Spanish-speaking children. So for children who are learning a second language, we did a study in actually in the Los Angeles Unified School District and looked at academic progress from kindergarten through 5th grade. And what we found was that kindergarten, at the end of preschool and kindergarten, children's phonemic awareness, alphabetic knowledge, all the things that go into sort of this understanding of the technical aspects, the mechanics, the word knowledge skills, they were at par with their peers. So they had their phonics instruction. I mean, they knew them with good phonics instruction, for instance, or phonemic awareness, vocabulary skills, et cetera. They were not behind. But then when you got to about the middle of 1st grade, they did not have the oral language concepts in either language to understand what it was they were reading. So it was comprehension, which is based on oral language, that was really the neglected aspect of early language and literacy in our bilingual programs. And actually, when I saw this, the trajectory was just so overwhelming, I was actually kind of stunned. And then we did our own research, confirmed it. And then people from the East Coast, multiple districts across the East Coast, confirmed it out there with their populations as well. So I think that's why we decided to focus on oral language, particularly in the preschool years. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what the 3 major components of POL really are: family supports. And for us and for everybody that does early childhood, the way that you identify strengths, the way that you identify family cultural values, the child's existing knowledge, the child's routines, et cetera, it comes from working with families. So initially, we really do need to establish those partnerships and that trust and that rapport before we can really effectively teach the child. And what POL has done is developed a whole series of tools and training materials so that teachers feel comfortable in working with families, even when they don't share a language as well. But so at first, our very first year, when we were implementing this, teachers did not want to sit down one-on-one and work with families that didn't speak their whole language. And then gradually, everybody sort of came to this awareness that, wow, I learned so much about these children that I didn't know before. And then teachers became very enthusiastic about this process. It wasn't a burden add-on. It was really essential to teaching. And then instructional supports, very specific and explicit instructional strategies from, how to conduct interactive reading lessons, how to introduce vocabulary in both languages, things like that. Things that we've talked about a little bit. And then the environmental supports, which, of course, how do we set up the environment so children see their language, see their culture, see their families, activities, see all of that around them so they feel accepted and valued within a classroom. Can I go to the next slide, please?
I think right now, before we move on, we have a few minutes, and I'd like to, for all of our panelists to, in a very, very brief way, kind of make this final point. And the point is about making cross-linguistic connections. So theme I've heard you mention, Linda, as you were describing the research and POL, also heard you talk about it as you were mentioning SEAL, and of course, translanguaging. So if you don't mind, we have a couple of slides. I think pictures are helpful in this case, but we have like 1 minute, maybe 45 seconds per panelist, just to leave us wanting more. Let's start with Gladys. Actually, I'll start with you, Gladys, and then I'll transition to Heather and Linda. How does that sound? All right, Gladys. So we've talked about the need for cross-linguistic connections, a strong oral language foundation, like all those things, right? And you mentioned a word that I personally like, but I'm not always sure that we all know what it means. So this one is called metalinguistic awareness. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is metalinguistic awareness and how do cross-linguistic connections create that for children? And then we'll jump into some examples, but it has to be brief. I'm sorry, but let's can do this. And let's go to the previous slides, please.
So in simple terms, metalinguistic awareness refers to ability to think about language and to analyze and understand how language works and how it's used, right? So for multilingual children, in 45 seconds, what I'll say is that for multilingual and bilingual children in particular, metalinguistic awareness entails multilingual awareness as well, right? So like this idea that the double R sound doesn't in one language, but it doesn't one in the other, right? This idea that if you translate refranes or expressions, literally, it sounds very funny or wrong, right? Like kids do in Así se dice, which Seal has great examples of, by the way, video examples. And some other examples that we can show there in the previous slides of thinking syntactically how sentence structures differ, right? That awareness of how we use language and how languages are used differently at a societal level in different contexts with different audience members, that is metalinguistic awareness. And it's important to foster this metalinguistic awareness in bilingual children because it helps them develop their biliteracy skills and their awareness of how language works in society, but also most importantly, I'd say, is their self-awareness of how their languages work and how they choose to use their linguistic repertoire. And studies show that children are able to do this from a young age, beginning even as young as preschool. So it's super important. I'll pass it to Heather.
Great. Thanks, Gladys. Just to add on, as kiddos are developing language skills, they're not just learning vocabulary, but they're also learning about how words are constructed, how they're organized into thoughts, into sentences. And we know every language has these regular structures and these rules. What children do when learning a new language is they internalize these rules and then they use them to generalize. And sometimes this works, but sometimes it doesn't. For example, a kiddo might say something like, I'm wearing the jacket of my mom. And some might call this a grammatical error, but we call this an approximation. This is a bilingual child doing something brilliant. They're testing out a linguistic rule that they learned in Spanish and applying it to English. So they need to be celebrated for this sophisticated thinking that they're doing and then taught, oh, here's the correct form of how we do possessives in English. Research is really clear on this, that when learners of two different languages have time and space and dedicated instruction to discover those similarities and differences between the two language systems, they become stronger in each language. Simply put, they understand each language better. Have a lot more to say, but maybe we'll do it in the post discussion.
Thank you. There's so much to say. I think one thing that's striking to me, it's like teachers need to know language really well to be able to help children foster cross-linguistic connections. And that sounds like a big task for teachers, right? And it's not just teachers' roles. So I know I asked you, Linda, to share cross-linguistic strategy, but I know you've also done work with workforce preparation, things of that nature. What do you think teachers need to know in order to apply these instructional practices around cross-linguistic connections well? And
Are you me? Sorry. So that was. Can I say one little thing about metalinguistic awareness? It actually happens in the first year of life. That babies as young as 9 months of age can distinguish between languages based upon their phonetic rhythms and sounds. They can separate out, even when it's the same speaker or a different speaker, who's speaking which language, and through that they start to understand the structures of languages, that languages can have multiple meanings, different words for the same item. The book sounds different in Spanish, etc. So it's really a neurocognitive capacity that can be built from infancy that then gets strengthened over time with continued exposure to multiple languages. And I'll just say this really quickly, but there are some tribes in Africa, for instance, that speak 17 dialects of a language because their community has to, because of the trading and partnerships that they have. But your question wasn't about that. Your question was about cross-linguistic connections and how we do it. Okay. And I mean, this is, I think, an issue of common understanding of terminology that we all use. Because, I mean, we use translanguaging in the preschool years. That's an automatic feature of preschool classrooms. And it has been for a long time. I mean, in terms of quality standards, that you really encourage children to use whatever language they can to express themselves fully. That should happen at different times during the day. That should happen when they're with their peers. That should happen, when you're having informal conversations with them. And the language and how it's used, and if you're doing a specific lesson, is really defined by what that goal of that lesson is. So if you have a goal of vocabulary instruction in English, you might start it with a cognate chart. For instance, even in preschool, we do this. Telephone or telephone. So you use so they start to see and build upon, hopefully, what they have been learning since infancy and toddlerhood, that they build upon it then to continue to expand upon a sophisticated understanding of how these two languages connect. And we as educators never restrict that child's mode of expression. And I would call that, I mean, we now call it cross-language connections, translanguaging. I mean, we used to call it children code switch, and that's fine. That's part of their progress in acquiring emergent bilingualism. So we can do these things in a very deliberate way with the materials we choose, the languages that we choose, the partners we choose to be in our classrooms, conversing with our children, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I didn't mention, Early Edge California actually has a wonderful website called the Multilingual Toolkit. And it's right now pre-K to third grade. It has lots of SEAL materials. It has lots of poem materials. And it's a wonderful resource on everything. Family engagement, specific literacy strategies, how to read a book in multiple languages, for instance. And you can access those free through their multilingual. If you just Google Early Edge California Multilingual Toolkit, you will come to it. It's extensive, and it's such a valuable resource for anybody that works with young dual language learners.
We just put the link in the chat. I just Googled it as you were talking. So thank you. I know we're way past our time, but since we started a little bit late, I just wanted to wrap up briefly with one final question. This is a complicated topic, so I just want to say thank you to each of you for bringing such expertise, knowledge, and passion to the topic, in addition to our wonderful co-teachers, Ms. Hoich and Ms. Santiago, that also provided wonderful insight. Well, I know we've talked about pedagogy, curriculum instruction, and we're going to talk about assessment in our next webinar, which will be in November 15th. We'll make sure to put the link to this upcoming webinar and also our webinar series page as we wrap up. But I know that it's kind of hard. We need a bridge to talk between this panel and our next panel. So I'll ask you, Heather, real quick. When we're thinking about the importance of providing children with cross-linguistic connections to build their meta-linguistic awareness, are there any quick assessment considerations that could inform teaching?
Yeah, thanks so much. So imagine two waterfalls falling into a single pool. This is like the bilingual child's brain, right? What is known and understood in one language contributes to what is known and understood in the other language. Input can come in the form of these two different languages, but then the learning combines into this deep pool, and it's impossible to separate it back out into my English particle or my Spanish particle. And unfortunately, the education for multilingual students has historically been addressed using ideas and approaches and benchmarks that are created just for monolingual students. And this practice has really increased the inequities for our bilingual students from the moment these learning expectations are set to the moment their performance is being evaluated. We know that our emerging bilinguals are different from monolingual English students and from monolingual Spanish students or Mandarin students. And that if we use a monolingual interpretation and assessment, we're really underestimating what students can do. When we instead understand that biliteracy, like you said, Linda, is a more challenging form of literacy, it's a more rigorous form of biliteracy than English-only literacy, then we see this need for an assets-based, holistic interpretation of bilingual growth and development that celebrates rather than penalizes the dual language brain. So really excited for the next webinar and for that discussion.
Thank you so much to each of you. And that was a perfect ending to today's discussion. Just to summarize, put a nice bow on it, we cannot use monolingual approaches of pedagogy, curricular instruction, and assessment to support emergent bilinguals. We do have some best recommended practices and areas for further research and development. And so the conversation is not just for teachers, even though that's who we are usually talking about when we're thinking about pedagogy, curriculum instruction. And at the heart of it, we need all these things to be aligned to make sure that we sustain children's authentic cultural and linguistic identity. So thank you so much to each of our panelists and our attendees, both live and those who are going to be viewing at a later time. We can't wait for our next webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.